Hello, my name is Ariana Priest, and today I'm going to be discussing ableism in schools. So, for those who don't know, ableism is a prejudice or mindset that views people with disabilities in a negative sort of perspective. So, this prejudice isn't always conscious. A lot of the times, it comes in microaggressions that are unconscious. As humans, it's human nature to be curious and to want to fix things that we think are broken, or things that we don't understand. And a lot of the time, people are uneducated about people with disabilities. One example of this is when someone without a disability encounters someone who has a stutter. A lot of the time they will interrupt their sentence and finish it for them, thinking that they're helping them when they're stuttering. In reality, this just makes them feel embarrassed and will likely prevent them from engaging in, socialization from then on, because they feel like they're being deemed as incapable of completing the sentence themselves just because they have a hard time talking. This and many other situations like this is what has led to a lot of the social isolation of people with disabilities in RCS and just in schools in general. And that's very harmful to people with disabilities because socialization is crucial for, child development. So I surveyed people in RCS to see what their thoughts on ableism are. And 50% of people reported that they have witnessed ableist behavior inside the RCS buildings. And when they were asked about whether or not they feel like people with disabilities are socially, segregated from people, whether this being in like the cafeteria, in the halls, or whether or not, we feel like students are really engaging with people who have disabilities. And 70.3% said that they feel like they are socially isolated. So, this social isolation has been proven to affect people with disabilities for the rest of their lives, whether that's going to college because they feel like their experience with high school and middle school, elementary school was already bad enough. They don't want to continue their education. Creating, social relationships. They're scared to get the motivation to do that and the motivation to get a career, because they feel like they'll be treated differently from, non-disabled employees. As of 2023, only 20% of people with disabilities were employed, whereas the general, percentage of people without disabilities was 60%. While the treatment of people with disabilities has definitely improved over the last century, we went from putting people with disabilities in asylums and just kind of hiding them from the public, treating them like they were some sort of like mistake or embarrassment, to seeing them in, magazines, in movies, represented in science and even politics. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done regarding, just the curriculum in schools. There's not a lot of representation in schools of people with disabilities, other than like Franklin Roosevelt being in a wheelchair for a period of time. There are a lot of pieces of literature that we could use to show people with disabilities in classrooms in a positive light, and I feel like there's a lot more that could be included in curriculums to educate people on disabilities and just kind of try and get rid of a lot of the ableist behavior that we're seeing in RCS.
Simply, ableism is when there's an inherent bias against people with a disability. And that takes many forms that we all have internalized. As a special education teacher, I often think about the ways in which I have been ableist in the day. And that's true. Because I think as an educator, especially a special education teacher, you have to be self-reflective all the time about how you're projecting in space.
Ableism assumes that typical abilities are superior and that people with a disability need fixing. A lot of these biases can be directed toward physical disabilities, but also mental disabilities, learning disabilities, or even something like a language barrier.
It's really easy in school to like segregate students based on ability levels, even if you're trying not to, right? So like when you're talking about inclusive classrooms, it's like, well, what does inclusion look like? It's not enough just to have students with disabilities sitting in your classroom. How are we as teachers, both SPED, Gen Ed teachers, and schools, like really actively helping those students to engage socially and with the material? There's like all kinds of cool things you can do, but it's not enough just to put them in there and then to give them a small group in the back of the room. That's not enough.
Socially engaging education is something Jeremy is doing to give students some agency over their learning, allowing the students to understand how they can contribute to a given lesson with one another.
So like some of the students with intellectual disabilities were being overhelped, so they weren't really learning the skills that they needed to learn for independence. We really have to get them to see themselves as equals and to have everybody else see them as like co-equal partners. So one of the things we did is we approached a couple of the students, one in particular with Down syndrome, and asked him to lead what we call community circle, where he would work and discuss with all the other students around the ideas of disability, but also more importantly, it was focused on like the idea of weakness and strengths. So we worked with him for a little bit to get the presentation going, but really he talked about what it meant for him to have Down syndrome. You know, he's taking over the defining moment about his disability. He's prideful about it and sharing about it. And then more importantly, he's talking about what he feels he has strengths in and where he needs help and how they can help him. And then this is where it flips. Then he led a discussion with all the other students where they had to answer to each other about, well, where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? Where can they be helped? Where can they be supported? And so it was a really awesome moment where like all these other students who were trying to figure out how to help him realized really quickly that like, oh, he can tell us what he needs. And oh, and by the way, something that he might be really good at is something that I struggle with.
Remember that deficit mindset? By looking at strengths and using asset-based language, students can find ways to engage, rather than simply identifying ways they cannot. This new way of thinking allows one to also see ability on a spectrum rather than in absolutes.
We all have neurological profiles. We all learn differently. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and everybody brings value to that space and can help each other out. And I think like what's really cool about those types of moments is that students really begin to understand the action of inclusion, which is like, this is an act. We actively talk and interact with each other. We actively see the value and strengths of people with disabilities, and we view them as co-equals in our democracy.